My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 7 years. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Our little boy, Caleb, was our world. At 5 years old, he had a smile that could disarm anyone, his laugh like music. We were the kind of couple people envied, not because we were rich or glamorous, but because we were happy. That day started like any other. Emily had taken Caleb to the park while I tinkered in the garage, pretending I knew something about fixing our aging lawnmower. The sound of Caleb's footsteps running up the driveway, his voice calling, "Daddy," as he held up a crayon drawing for me to admire, was the highlight of my day. Then the accident happened. It was quick, too quick. A distracted driver, a flash of headlights, and the sickening crunch of metal against flesh. The sound still echoes in my head. Even now, Caleb didn't stand a chance. I remember Emily's scream as she ran to him, the way her knees hit the pavement as if her own body had given up. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, until the paramedics came. They told us it was instantaneous, that Caleb hadn't suffered, but their words did nothing to soothe the jagged shards of grief tearing through my chest. The days that followed were a blur. Funeral arrangements, casseroles from well-meaning neighbors, and a hollow silence that filled our house. Emily and I clung to each other at first, desperate to find solace in our shared loss. But grief is a cruel thing. It doesn't unite, it divides. The cracks began small. A misplaced comment, a forgotten chore. Then came the accusations. "Why weren't you watching him?" she spat one night, her voice dripping with venom. I didn't respond because the truth was, I asked myself the same question every waking moment. The nights became unbearable. Emily and I shared the same bed but lived in separate worlds. She spent her hours staring blankly at the ceiling, while I stared at the bottle of bourbon on the nightstand, debating whether drowning my guilt in alcohol would make it easier. I never did drink it, though. Something about staying sharp felt like punishment, and I deserved that. It started small. Emily staying late at work more often, her phone buzzing in the middle of the night. I tried not to notice, convincing myself that she was just throwing herself into her job to cope. People deal with grief in their own ways, I told myself. Then one evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring at a half-eaten plate of spaghetti. Emily had texted, "Working late. Don't wait up." It wasn't the first time, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't be the last. Caleb's empty chair at the dining table made the silence deafening. To fill the void, I went out to the garage, the one place that still felt like mine. I tinkered with the old lawnmower, even though it had been running fine for weeks. The tools in my hands were a distraction, but my mind betrayed me, wandering back to the accident. The screech of tires, Caleb's laugh cutting short. I threw the wrench across the room and sank to the floor. That's when I noticed it. Emily's car pulling into the driveway. I checked the clock. It was nearly midnight. My heart thudded as I watched her step out, her heels clacking against the pavement. She looked different, not like someone who'd been slogging through spreadsheets and conference calls. Her makeup was fresh. Her lips painted a shade of red I hadn't seen her wear in years. I didn't confront her, not then. Instead, I watched as she walked inside, her perfume lingering in the air. She didn't notice me in the garage. She didn't notice much of anything anymore. The questions clawed at my insides. Was it someone at work? A client? A random stranger? But the worst part wasn't that I suspected her. It was that I couldn't even muster the energy to be angry. I felt numb, hollowed out, as if Caleb's death had drained the last bit of fight from me. That night, Emily climbed into bed beside me without a word. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she silenced it quickly. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing. It was steady, calm, as if she had no trouble sleeping. Meanwhile, my chest felt like it was about to implode. I told myself I was imagining things. I wanted to believe that more than anything. But deep down, I knew the truth. We were both breaking. And soon, there wouldn't be anything left to save. Weeks passed, and the distance between Emily and me grew insurmountable. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was clipped, transactional. "Did you pick up groceries? Don't forget the car insurance." I found myself avoiding home, taking on extra shifts or inventing errands just to dodge the suffocating silence. One evening, I came home to an empty house. Emily's car was gone, as usual, but something felt different. I couldn't explain it, just a gnawing sensation in my gut that wouldn't let go. I wandered aimlessly through the living room, my eyes landing on Caleb's favorite toys, still scattered on the shelves where he'd left them. I should have put them away months ago, but I couldn't. Packing them up felt like erasing him. And even though Emily never said it out loud, I could tell she hated seeing them, like they were ghosts haunting her every step. I was about to head to the kitchen when Emily's laptop caught my eye. She rarely used it at home anymore, but tonight it was open on the dining table. The screen glowed faintly, prompting for a password. I froze. I knew this was crossing a line, a point of no return, but the buzzing in my head wouldn't stop. My hands trembled as I typed in Caleb's name, the only password she might have used that I could guess. The desktop opened, and I felt a pang of guilt. But what I found next erased any second thoughts. There were emails, dozens of them, all sent to a single address. "I can't stop thinking about you," one read. "Last night was perfect," said another. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the thread, piecing together a narrative I didn't want to believe. His name was Jason. He wasn't from her work, or even someone we knew before Caleb's death. He was a stranger, a bartender she'd met on one of her late nights. The messages were explicit, raw, filled with a passion I hadn't seen from her in years. My stomach churned as I read her words she used to reserve for me. I shut the laptop with a force that made the screen flicker. My fists clenched, and for a moment, I thought about smashing it against the wall. But what good would that do? It wouldn't change the truth staring me in the face. Emily was having an affair, and while part of me had suspected it, seeing the proof hit me like a freight train. When she came home that night, I was sitting in the dark. I heard her keys jingle as she unlocked the door, the click of her heels on the tile floor. She hesitated when she saw me, probably noticing the tension in the air. "You're up late," she said, her voice neutral, almost dismissive. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached into my pocket and slid my phone across the table toward her. On the screen was a photo of the emails, my proof. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she looked at me like a cornered animal, her eyes wide and panicked. Then, just as quickly, she regained her composure. "Did you go through my laptop?" she asked, her tone icy. "That's all you have to say?" I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. "Not an explanation? Not an apology?" Emily crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she said. "Not after everything." "After everything?" I repeated, incredulous. "Caleb's death isn't a free pass to betray me, Emily." She flinched at the mention of his name. For a brief moment, I thought I saw guilt flash across her face, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, defiant glare. "Maybe if you hadn't shut me out," she hissed, "I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. I stood there, stunned, as she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house. The door slammed behind her, leaving me in a silence so heavy it felt like it might crush me. I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. I had known we were broken, but this felt like the point of no return. The days after Emily's confession felt like a waking nightmare. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, heartbreak, and despair. Every moment replayed in my head like a relentless movie reel. Her words, her tone, the coldness in her eyes. Emily didn't come home that night or the next. I tried calling her once, but it went straight to voicemail. That was enough for me. I wasn't going to beg for answers or forgiveness. I was done chasing a woman who had already decided to leave me in every way that mattered. But the house was unbearable without her. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. The photos of us, once happy and full of life, mocked me from their frames on the walls. Caleb's room was the worst. I couldn't bring myself to step inside, though I often lingered in the doorway, staring at his tiny bed and the shelf of untouched books. One night I decided to get out. I couldn't sit in that house any longer, drowning in memories and unanswered questions. So I found myself at a dive bar on the edge of town. The kind of place where the lights are dim, the jukebox is always playing old country songs, and no one asks too many questions. I nursed a whiskey, the burn in my throat a welcome distraction from the ache in my chest. The bartender, a burly man with a kind face, gave me a sympathetic nod. I must have looked as pathetic as I felt. "Rough night?" he asked, setting another glass in front of me without waiting for an answer. "You have no idea," I muttered, taking a sip. That's when I noticed her. A woman at the end of the bar, her dark hair cascading over one shoulder, a cigarette balanced delicately between her fingers. She was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like she carried secrets too heavy to share. Our eyes met briefly, and she offered a small, knowing smile. I didn't approach her, but she made the first move. Sliding onto the stool next to me, she introduced herself as Rachel. Her voice was low and smooth, like she'd seen her share of heartache and knew how to wear it well. "Let me guess," she said, tilting her glass toward me. "Wife trouble." I laughed bitterly. "Something like that." We talked for hours, or maybe it was just minutes. Time felt slippery that night, the alcohol dulling my senses. Rachel didn't pry, but there was something comforting about her presence. She listened without judgment, offering bits of her own story in return. A messy divorce, a career that didn't pan out, a life that hadn't turned out the way she'd hoped. By the time the bar closed, I wasn't ready to say goodbye. Neither was she. We ended up walking along the deserted streets, the cool night air sobering me slightly. "I'm not looking for anything serious," she said, her eyes searching mine. "But sometimes, it's nice to feel like you're not alone." I didn't respond, but when she reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. We ended up at her place, a small apartment above a bookstore. She poured us another drink, and we sat on her couch, talking until the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds. I didn't stay long after that. As the city woke up around us, I made my excuses and left. But as I drove home, guilt began to creep in. I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, a temporary escape. But deep down, I knew I had crossed a line, and there was no erasing what had happened. When I walked through the door of my house, the emptiness hit me again. Nothing had changed. If anything, I felt worse. Whatever solace I'd sought with Rachel, it hadn't filled the gaping hole in my chest. And it certainly hadn't fixed the mess that was my marriage or my life. Emily was still gone. Caleb was still gone. And now, so was the man I used to be. Emily came home 2 days later. It was early in the morning, and I was sitting on the couch, bleary-eyed and clutching a coffee mug like it was the only thing holding me together. She walked in quietly, her heels dangling from one hand, the other clutching her purse. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged. For a moment we just stared at each other. She looked like she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving me alone with the knot in my chest. Later that day, when we finally spoke, the conversation was as cold as the space between us. I wanted to ask where she'd been, but I didn't have the energy to start another fight. Emily, for her part, seemed content to pretend nothing had happened. She moved around the house with the detachment of a stranger, her eyes never quite meeting mine. It wasn't long before the arguments resumed. They started small, over insignificant things. Laundry left unfolded, an unpaid bill, but quickly escalated into full-blown battles. Every fight seemed to circle back to Caleb, like his absence was a wound we couldn't stop picking at. One night I finally snapped. "Do you even care about us anymore?" I shouted, slamming my fist on the dining table. "Or are you too busy with Jason to notice what's happening here?" Emily froze, her eyes narrowing. "Don't you dare bring him into this," she hissed. "You think I'm the only one to blame for how far we've fallen? You haven't been here for me, Mark. Not once since Caleb died." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but deep down, I knew there was truth in what she said. I had shut down after Caleb's death, retreating into myself while Emily floundered. But knowing I'd failed her didn't make her betrayal any easier to stomach. "You could have talked to me," I said, my voice shaking. "We could have worked through it. But instead, you ran to someone else." Emily's face crumpled, her tough exterior cracking for the first time in months. "I didn't know how to talk to you," she whispered. "Every time I looked at you, all I saw was Caleb. All I felt was guilt." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought we might finally start to bridge the chasm between us. But then Emily straightened her shoulders, wiping away a stray tear. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, her voice hardening again. "We're too far gone." That night, I lay awake in our bed, listening to the sound of her breathing. She seemed so far away, even though she was just inches from me. I reached out, hesitated, and then let my hand fall back to my side. Touching her felt impossible now, like we were both encased in glass, close enough to see each other but worlds apart. In the days that followed, Emily stopped coming home altogether. She stayed out late, sometimes not returning at all. I stopped asking where she was or who she was with. It didn't matter anymore. The bond we'd once shared, the laughter, the intimacy, the dreams for the future. It was all gone, buried under the weight of our grief and mistakes. I tried to focus on work, on anything that might keep my mind occupied. But the house, so full of memories, became unbearable. Every corner held a reminder of the life we'd lost. Caleb's favorite blanket still draped over the armchair, his crayon drawings taped to the fridge. I couldn't bring myself to take them down, even though looking at them felt like twisting the knife in my chest. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I heard a faint buzzing sound. Emily's phone, left carelessly on the counter. Without thinking, I picked it up and unlocked it. Caleb's birthday was still the passcode. The messages were there, plain as day. Jason's name filled the screen, each text a fresh wound. "Can't wait to see you tonight," one read. Another, more recent, simply said, "Miss you." I put the phone down, my hands trembling. This was the moment I'd feared, the confirmation of everything I'd tried to deny. Emily wasn't just gone physically. She was gone emotionally, mentally, completely. And for the first time, I realized I might not get her back. The night after finding Emily's messages, I sat in Caleb's room for the first time in months. His scent still lingered faintly, a mixture of baby shampoo and crayons. His favorite stuffed dinosaur sat on the bed, its button eyes staring at me accusingly. I broke down, the weight of everything crashing over me at once. The loss of Caleb, the collapse of my marriage, the anger, the betrayal. It all came spilling out in heaving sobs. For months, I had tried to push it all down, pretending I could bear the weight. But now it was unbearable. Something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a house that felt like a tomb, clinging to a marriage that was already dead. For the first time since Caleb's accident, I realized I had a choice. I could stay in this misery, or I could try to reclaim what was left of my life. The next morning, I called my boss and requested a week off. I didn't tell him why, and he didn't ask. He just muttered something about taking care of myself and hung up. I packed a bag and left the house without saying a word to Emily. Not that she was there to notice, her car was gone as usual. I drove aimlessly for hours, the miles blurring together as I wrestled with my thoughts. I didn't have a plan, just a vague idea that I needed to get away. Eventually, I found myself at a small motel on the outskirts of a neighboring town. It wasn't much, just a single bed, a rickety desk, and a window overlooking a gas station. But it was enough. For the first few days, I did nothing but sleep and stare at the ceiling. The quiet was strange at first, almost unsettling, but it gave me space to think. I started to piece together the fragments of my life, trying to make sense of how everything had fallen apart. By the fourth day, I felt a sliver of clarity. I realized I had been holding on to Emily out of fear of being alone, fear of facing the world without her. But the truth was I was already alone, and the only way to move forward was to let go. That night, I wrote Emily a letter. I poured out everything I had been too afraid to say. The pain of losing Caleb, the resentment I felt toward her for shutting me out, and the guilt I carried for failing her as a husband. I told her I loved her, but I couldn't keep living like this. When I returned home, I found the house exactly as I had left it. Empty and eerily silent. I placed the letter on the kitchen counter, along with my wedding ring. Then I packed a few more things and walked out the door without looking back. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But as I drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't drowning in anger or despair. I was still broken, still grieving, but I was finally moving forward. Or so I thought. 2 weeks passed before Emily reached out. I had settled into a small apartment a few towns over. Nothing fancy but enough to start fresh. I'd taken a job at a nearby hardware store. Something simple to keep my mind occupied. Most nights were quiet, spent flipping through old photo albums of Caleb or staring at the peeling wallpaper. When my phone buzzed late one evening, her name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the silence stretch on forever. But curiosity or maybe weakness got the better of me. "Hello," I said, my voice tight. There was a pause, followed by a shaky exhale. "Mark, I got your letter," Emily said. Her voice sounded raw, like she'd been crying. I didn't respond right away. The words I'd written were a closure for me, not an invitation to reopen old wounds. But she kept talking. I know I don't deserve anything from you," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "But I need to see you. Please." "What's the point, Emily?" I asked, my tone colder than I intended. "We've already said everything that needed to be said. I just need to explain," she said, her voice breaking. "Not for us, just for me. Please." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We chose a diner halfway between our two towns, a neutral ground. I arrived early, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon reminding me of Saturday mornings when Caleb would beg for pancakes. Emily arrived a few minutes later. She looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. She slid into the booth across from me, her hands trembling as she picked up the menu. "You look different," she said after a long silence. "Thinner." "So do you," I replied, my voice flat. "What do you want, Emily?" She flinched, but nodded, like she knew she deserved my coldness. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of a napkin. "About us, about Caleb, about what I did." I didn't say anything, letting her words hang in the air. "When Caleb died, I didn't just lose him," she said, her voice cracking. "I lost myself. And I know that's no excuse, but I didn't know how to cope. Jason, he wasn't about love or even passion. He was a distraction, a way to escape." I clenched my fists under the table, the familiar anger bubbling up. But I forced myself to stay calm. "And now," I asked, "is he still your escape?" She shook her head vehemently. "No. I ended it weeks ago. He was never what I wanted." "Then what do you want, Emily?" I asked, my voice rising. "To apologize? To make yourself feel better?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I want to say I'm sorry, for everything. For Caleb, for Jason, for shutting you out. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed you to hear it." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I stared at her, searching for some hint of manipulation, some ulterior motive. But all I saw was a broken woman, as lost as I had been. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admitted, my voice low. "Not yet." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I understand. I hope someday you can." We sat in silence for a long time after that, neither of us knowing what to say. When we finally parted ways, there was no dramatic goodbye, no promises of reconciliation. Just a quiet understanding that this chapter of our lives was over. Or so I thought. Life went on, or at least it tried to. Emily's apology lingered in my mind, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. I didn't know if it was genuine closure or the start of something else. Either way, I tried to focus on moving forward. A few weeks after our meeting, I came home from work to find a note taped to my apartment door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message short and cryptic. "You don't know the whole story. Call me." Below it was a phone number, written hastily, as though the writer had been in a hurry. My first instinct was to throw it away. I didn't want to be pulled back into whatever drama Emily might still be tangled in. But curiosity gnawed at me. Who had left the note? And what didn't I know? I hesitated for hours, pacing my tiny apartment, the note crumpled in my hand. Finally, unable to resist, I dialed the number. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Hello? Who is this?" I asked, my tone guarded. "You don't know me," the man said. "But I know your wife. Or ex-wife, I guess." There was a pause. "Name's Jason." My blood ran cold. Jason, the man Emily had been seeing. I almost hung up, but his next words stopped me. "She's in trouble," he said. "And I think you need to know why." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. Jason sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "Look, I screwed up. Okay? I didn't just ruin your marriage. I got her involved in something dangerous. I thought I could protect her, but it spiraled out of control." "Spit it out, Jason," I snapped. "What the hell is going on?" "There's a guy," he said, his voice lowering. "Someone I owe money to. A lot of money. Emily, she got caught up in it. I didn't mean for it to happen, but now he's threatening her." My stomach churned. It sounded like the kind of story you'd hear in a bad movie. But Jason's tone was deadly serious. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why not go to the cops?" "Because the cops won't fix this," Jason replied. "This guy doesn't play by the rules." I didn't know who else to turn to. I felt a wave of anger surge through me. Jason had dragged Emily into his mess, and now he was asking me to clean it up? But beneath the anger was something else. Fear. For all her faults, Emily didn't deserve this. And if Caleb were still alive, I knew what he would have wanted me to do. "Give me his name," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Jason hesitated. "His name's Vance. He runs some shady business out of the old industrial park on the edge of town. But listen, this guy's dangerous. Don't do anything stupid." I hung up without responding, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was walking into, but one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore it. Emily might have broken my heart, but I wasn't going to let her pay for Jason's mistakes. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. My hands trembled as I locked the apartment behind me, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like a vice. Whatever came next, I knew there was no turning back. The industrial park Jason mentioned was a relic from another era. Rows of crumbling buildings with broken windows and rusted fences. The kind of place that felt abandoned even when it wasn't. As I pulled into the empty lot, the streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows. Jason had told me to meet him here, claiming he could explain everything in person. I wasn't sure I trusted him, but I needed answers. More importantly, I needed to know Emily was safe. I parked near an old loading dock and waited, the cold seeping into my bones as the minutes dragged on. Finally, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A beat-up sedan rolled into view, its engine sputtering as it came to a stop. Jason stepped out, his face gaunt and his movements jittery, like a man living on borrowed time. "You came," he said, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. He looked smaller in person, more desperate. "Where is she?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Jason glanced around nervously. "She's fine for now. Vance doesn't want to hurt her. He just wants his money." "How much?" I demanded, stepping closer. 50 grand, Jason muttered, barely meeting my eyes. "I told him I'd have it by next week." "But, you don't have it?" I finished for him, my voice dripping with disdain. "So now he's using Emily as leverage." Jason nodded, his jaw tightening. "I didn't mean for this to happen, man. I swear. I wanted to hit him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he'd caused. But there was no time for that." "Where is Vance?" I asked. Jason hesitated, then gestured toward one of the larger warehouses at the edge of the lot. In there. But you can't just walk in. He's got guys. I'll handle it, I said, turning toward the building. Wait, Jason called after me. You don't understand. These people don't mess around. If you go in there. I stopped and looked back at him. If you had thought about that earlier, we wouldn't be here, would we? Jason fell silent, his face pale. I turned and continued toward the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the louder the hum of machinery and muffled voices became. I found a side entrance, the rusted metal door slightly ajar. Peering inside, I saw a makeshift office at the far end of the room, its windows glowing with yellow light. Two men stood outside, smoking and laughing, their voices carrying through the still night air. I crept along the shadows, keeping low. My mind raced, cycling through every possible scenario. What was I doing? I wasn't a hero or some action movie protagonist. I was just a grieving father and a broken husband, trying to fix a situation I didn't even fully understand. As I got closer to the office, I spotted her. Emily. She was sitting on a chair inside, her wrists bound and her head bowed. She looked exhausted but unharmed. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by anger. I had no plan, no backup. All I had was raw determination and a deep, unshakable need to protect her. I ducked behind a stack of crates, formulating a plan. The guards outside the office were the immediate problem. If I could distract them, I might have a chance to get Emily out without anyone noticing. But before I could act, Jason's voice rang out behind me. "Vance?" he shouted, stepping into the open. My stomach dropped. The guards snapped to attention, reaching for their weapons as Jason raised his hands in mock surrender. He was doing something stupid, something reckless. "Jason, what the hell are you doing?" I hissed under my breath. But it was too late. The guards dragged him toward the office, and I could only watch as the door slammed shut behind them. Whatever was about to happen, I knew one thing. I wasn't leaving without Emily, even if it meant putting myself in danger. The warehouse grew quieter as Jason was dragged inside. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding in my ears. Through the grimy office windows, I could see the scene unfolding. Vance, a broad-shouldered man in a leather jacket, loomed over Jason, his presence as menacing as the knife he casually twirled in his hand. Emily sat nearby, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes darting between Jason and Vance. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Jason's desperate gestures told me he was pleading, probably trying to buy more time. Vance didn't look convinced. He slammed the knife onto the desk, causing Emily to flinch. The guards outside the door shifted uneasily, their hands on their weapons. I needed a plan, fast. My hands trembled as I scanned the warehouse for anything I could use. My eyes landed on a forklift parked nearby, its keys dangling from the ignition. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Carefully, I crept toward the forklift, staying low to avoid drawing attention. My breath hitched as my foot snagged on a loose piece of metal, sending a faint clang echoing through the room. The guards glanced in my direction, but I froze, my body pressed against a stack of pallets. After a tense moment, they turned back to the office, their laughter resuming. Reaching the forklift, I climbed in and turned the key. The engine roared to life, the sound startlingly loud in the cavernous space. The guards spun around, their hands flying to their holsters. "Who the hell is that?" one of them shouted. I didn't give them time to think. Slamming the pedal down, I drove the forklift straight at the office. The machine's engine whined as it picked up speed, the gap between me and the guards closing rapidly. One of them fired a shot, the bullet sparking off the metal frame, but I didn't stop. The forklift barreled into the office, shattering the flimsy walls and sending debris flying. Vance and Jason dove out of the way, but the commotion gave me the opening I needed. Jumping out of the forklift, I charged toward Emily, who was still bound to the chair. "Mark!" she gasped, her voice thick with shock and relief. "Hold on," I muttered, pulling a pocketknife from my jacket and slicing through the ropes around her wrists. She stumbled to her feet, her balance unsteady, but there was no time to waste. Vance recovered quickly, his face contorted with rage. "Get them!" he roared, gesturing to his guards. One of the guards lunged at me, but I swung the broken chair Emily had been tied to, catching him across the face. He crumpled to the floor, and I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the exit. The other guard blocked our path, his gun raised. Before he could fire, Jason tackled him from behind, shouting, "Go! Get out of here!" I hesitated, my instincts warring with my anger. Jason had caused this mess, but he was giving us a chance to escape. I tightened my grip on Emily's hand and ran, weaving through the maze of crates and machinery. Behind us, the sound of shouts and scuffling filled the air, followed by another gunshot. I didn't look back. We burst through the side door, the cool night air hitting us like a slap. My car was parked a short distance away, and I fumbled with the keys as we sprinted toward it. Emily climbed in first, and I slid into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I started the engine. Tires screeched as we sped out of the lot, leaving the chaos of the warehouse behind. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my chest heaving with adrenaline. Emily sat silently beside me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. After a few minutes, I pulled onto a quiet road and stopped the car. We sat there in the darkness, the only sound our ragged breathing. "Are you okay?" I finally asked, turning to her. Emily nodded, though tears streamed down her face. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We'll talk later," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Right now, we just need to figure out what to do next." In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. Whatever had happened back at the warehouse, it wasn't over. Not yet. The sirens faded into the distance as I drove aimlessly, my mind racing. Emily sat silently beside me, her hands trembling in her lap. The weight of what had just happened hung between us like a fog, thick and suffocating. Finally, I pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't safe to go back to my apartment, and Emily clearly couldn't return to wherever she'd been staying. We needed a place to regroup, even if only for a night. Inside the dimly lit room, Emily collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the last few months had finally broken her. I paced near the window, peeking through the thin curtains every few seconds, half expecting Vance or one of his men to appear. "Talk to me," I said finally, turning to face her. "What the hell were you thinking, Emily? How did it get this bad?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't know," she whispered. "After Caleb, everything just fell apart. I didn't know how to deal with it, and then Jason, he made me feel like I could forget for a little while. But it was a mistake. All of it." "You're damn right it was a mistake," I snapped, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "You dragged me into this mess, Emily. And for what? Because you couldn't face the truth?" Her lip quivered, but she didn't respond. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the motel's ancient heater. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. For Jason, for Vance, for everything." Her apology felt genuine, but it didn't bring the sense of relief I thought it might. Too much had happened, too much damage done. Still, I couldn't ignore the flicker of something in her eyes. Regret, maybe even hope. "Jason's still in there," I said, my tone softening slightly. "He saved us. Whatever else he's done, he didn't have to do that." Emily nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. He called me before you did. He said he wanted to make it right, that he would find a way to fix things. Do you think he'll survive?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if he doesn't, it'll be on me." I sighed and sank into the chair by the window, rubbing my temples. "This is bigger than just us now, Emily. Vance isn't going to let this go." "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We start over," I said, though the words tasted foreign in my mouth. "Not together. Not after everything that's happened. But you need to go somewhere safe. Get far away from here, and I'll deal with whatever fallout comes. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mark, you can't. I can, I interrupted. And I will. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for Caleb. He wouldn't want us living in fear for the rest of our lives. The mention of Caleb brought a fresh wave of tears, and Emily nodded, her expression resigned. You're right, she said. I'll leave. I'll figure something out. The room fell into a heavy silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. I knew this wasn't the clean resolution I had once hoped for. There were no neat endings, no moments of clarity. Just the reality of two people who had loved and lost and broken each other in ways that could never fully be repaired. In the morning, Emily packed a bag and left without a word. I watched her drive away, a strange mix of relief and sorrow settling in my chest. I didn't know where she was going, and I didn't ask. As for me, I stayed behind, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Vance was still out there, and Jason's fate was uncertain. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of purpose. I couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move forward. The end. Subscribe so you don't miss new and interesting stories.